Look here. If this greasy little scrap was sitting by the cook fire, most folks today would kick it into the dirt, and I wouldn't blame 'em. It looks nasty, slick, ugly. The kind of thing your wife tells you not to leave on the counter unless you're fixing to sleep out by the fence line. But a trail cook? He would not throw it away. No, sir. Because in the right hands, this ugly little scrap had 5 lives. The first, life gave light. The second sounds impossible. The third left the kitchen and climbed onto a saddle. The fourth fought the thing that turns iron orange. And the fifth is where this ugly scrap starts looking like Cowboy WD-40. Not because it was the same chemistry, it wasn't, but because it solved the same kind of problem. One cheap thing. A dozen little emergencies. And it started as dinner waste. That scrap was fat. Beef fat, mutton fat, the stuff left after cutting meat. Cut it small, heat it slow, let it melt down, strain off the rough bits, and once it cooled you had tallow. Now, tallow ain't mysterious. That's the whole trick. It was plain, cheap, ordinary, the kind of thing nobody writes songs about unless they've had too much coffee and not enough sleep. But frontier life had a way of making plain things powerful. And if you want to understand why a cowboy cook saved it, you've got to understand the world that little tin lived in. A cattle trail was not a picnic with hats. It was dust, rain, hard leather, wet iron, tired horses, squeaky gear, and men who are always one broken thing away from a long, miserable day. There was no hardware store over the next hill. No little red straw, no shelf full of miracle sprays. You had what the chuck wagon carried, what the animals gave you, and what the cook knew how to save. And that chuck wagon was not just a rolling pantry. It was the kitchen, the workshop, the medicine cabinet, and the complaint department, all smelling like coffee and beans. So when the cook looked at a scrap of fat, he wasn't asking, "Is this pretty?" Pretty don't pull a wagon. He was asking, "What can this still do?" And the first answer was simple: light. You take fat, you take a wick, and suddenly that ugly scrap is not ugly anymore. It's a candle. Not a fancy candle. Not one of those things that smells like mountain rain and costs $18. A working candle. A little flame in a dark room. A little flame beside a wagon. A little flame when the sun is down and you still need to mend a strap, find a boot, check a pot, or see what just made that noise outside camp. And this wasn't some made-up survival trick. I found an old California ranch memoir where tallow wasn't treated like trivia. It was sitting right there beside candle molds and soft soap, as ordinary as flour. That tells you something. When a thing shows up in the background of daily work, not as a miracle, but as just another chore, that's when you know it was real. Light was the obvious use, but the next one is stranger, because the same grease that made a dirty candle could also help make the thing that cleaned your hands. Soap, now I know. That sounds backwards. You're telling me grease becomes soap? Yep, that's exactly what I'm telling you. Old soap was not trying to impress anybody. It was fat and lie and patience. Chemistry, wearing work boots. And if you were living on a ranch, a farm, or out where supply wagons did not come when you wanted them, fat was not garbage. Fat was raw material. There are old domestic guides that talk about saving the dregs of melted fat for soap grease. And California records mention tallow being used for soap and candles too. So think about that. The animal feeds you, the leftover fat lights the dark. And then that same fat helps make the soap that cleans the work off your hands. That is not romance. That is economy with dirt under its fingernails. But soap still ain't the cowboy part. The cowboy part begins when that little tin leaves the kitchen. Because a cowboy's life depended on things that bent, rubbed, dried out, cracked, rusted, and squeaked. Start was leather. Boots, straps, harness, tack. You let leather dry out long enough, and it quits being your friend. It stiffens. It cracks. it bites back. And a man with bad boots is not having a philosophical problem. He is having a foot problem. And a foot problem becomes everybody's problem once there's work to do. There's an old pioneer recollection from Minnesota where a mother used a tallow dish to grease boots and make the leather soft and pliable again. That detail may sound small. It ain't. Small details are where real life hides. Nobody writes that down unless people actually did it. So now that ugly scrap has moved. It's not just cooking grease. It's not just candle stuff. It's not just soap grease. It is on your boots. It is on the things that bend. It is keeping leather from turning into a dry old cracker. And once you see that, the tin starts looking less like kitchen waste and more like a tool. But leather was only half the problem. The other enemy was orange. Rust. Rust is patient. Rust does not care if you are tired. Rust does not care if the drive starts at dawn. Rust just waits for moisture and air, then starts chewing on your iron like it paid for dinner. Now, old household science books explain this plain enough. A coating of tallow could help preserve ironware because it kept air and moisture away. That's not magic. That's a barrier. Rust needs moisture and air. Tallow sits there like a greasy little guard dog and says, "Not today." A knife, a pot, a hinge, a bit of exposed metal on gear. Maybe it won't save it forever, but out there, forever was not usually the assignment. The assignment was make it through the night, make it through the rain, make it through one more week until there's a town, a blacksmith, a store, or a better fix. Modern people ask, is this the best product? Trail people asked. Will it keep the trouble away long enough? Different question, different world. And that brings us to the last light, the one that makes the WD-40 comparison earn its beans. Friction. Anything that moves can start arguing with itself. A wheel, a hinge, a tool, a bit of gear that rubs where it shouldn't. And the older I get, the more I respect any substance that can make two stubborn things quit fighting for a while. Now, to be fair, this is where the comparison can go wrong. Tallow was not WD-40. WD-40 was born in 1953 in San Diego when the Rocket Chemical Company was working on rust prevention solvents and degreasers for aerospace. Their own history says it took 40 tries to get the water-displacing formula right, and one of its first big jobs was protecting the Atlas missile from rust and corrosion. So no, our trail cook was not brewing rocket solvent beside the beans. But the fantasy was the same. One thing in your hand that can stop a dozen little problems before they turn into one big problem. A squeak, a stuck thing, a wet thing, a rusty thing, a dry piece of leather, a part that needs one more chance. Cowboys understood that fantasy long before the spray can. They just didn't call it a product. They called it using what you had. And by now, that little scrap has changed category. At first, it looked like food waste. Then it became candle material, then soap material, then leather care, then rust protection, then grease. And after 5 lives, it ain't really one thing anymore. It's a problem solver. That's the real cowboy part. Not the gun, not the hat, not the sunset. The refusal to waste the second life of a thing. See, modern life trains us to buy a different bottle for every problem. One for leather, one for rust, one for cleaning, one for lubrication, one for candles, if you're feeling tender after supper. But frontier life didn't have room for that kind of nonsense. Every object had to earn its ride. A flour sack could become a towel. A coffee can could become a scoop. Wire could become a repair. A scrap of fat could become 5 different answers. That was not poverty thinking. That was trail intelligence. They did not ask, what is this called? They asked, what can it still do? And once you start asking that, the whole world changes shape. The cook fire stops being just where beans happen. It becomes the factory. The chuck wagon stops being a pantry. It becomes a rolling hardware store with coffee. And that dented little tin in a cowboy's hand? It stops looking like trash. It starts looking like knowledge. Now, I am not telling y'all to go smear beef fat all over your truck. Please don't do that. Your mechanic already has enough sadness in his life. But next time you see some ugly leftover and your first thought is, throw it away, remember the trail cook. He'd look at it longer. He'd turn it over in his hand. He'd think about dark and dirt and cracked leather and wet iron and something squeaking at the worst possible time. Then he'd drop it in a pot and say, hold on now. This thing's still got work in it. And I reckon that is the whole lesson. Not every treasure shines. Some of it just sits in a dented tin, smelling a little funny, waiting to fix everything.